Hi, I'm here with Kasie, and we're going to discuss her Ph.D. dissertation and the Picturesque and how that all got started. So, I'm glad you decided to come for the interview and our little discussion. It's not a big deal. It's not supposed to be a big deal. But I sent you some of the questions that I had in advance. So, we'll get to the details of your dissertation, but was there an event or a teacher or a course or something that influenced your choice of the academic career that you chose?
Yeah, I mean, you sent that question to me earlier, and it's kind of a complex thing to think through because I can't pick out just one particular moment. There's kind of a series of moments that led to my interest in academics, and then particularly in the specialty I chose, and ultimately my dissertation topic. But it really started in high school. I had a French teacher who made the effort to take us, her French students, even the French 1 students, to France. And she was also a painter and an artist herself. And so as part of our language class, she also involved a lot of art and culture, and that really started to fascinate me, and the direct interaction with those things, with the paintings.
The south of France?
Mostly Paris in the first trip, a little bit of Belgium, so the north. And
went
then
to the Louvre?
Yes, absolutely. The Louvre and the Musée d'Orsay. And that really, when I got to college, gave me the courage to go and live in France. And so I lived there. Yeah.
For how long?
For a year.
Okay.
And
junior year? Or?
Yeah, it was technically my junior year, though I kind of took a year off.
Okay. Yeah.
I was still technically with my university, but I was on independent study.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so while I was there, I was technically teaching French or English and thinking about teaching French as a career, and found myself just in art museums every weekend.
Oh, okay.
And so I decided when I got out of college that I wanted to study art history. I wanted to understand these things that I was seeing and that really infiltrate our lives at every level.
That's great. Well, that kind of leads into my second question. So that was something to be gained by you. That's something you wanted to do. And but what do you think is to be gained by students, and more broadly, civilization, let's call it, and the world even, by the study of art history in general? History in general. What do you think is the importance of it?
Well, I think art history is a really necessary and important discipline. It's come under a lot of fire recently, but I really think that art history teaches us to see. And I know that sounds like a mundane thing, but to be able to see and reflect on the things you're seeing, and not only understand how you are seeing, but to start to empathize with other people in other times, in other places, and try to understand how they see or saw the world. And art is really a manifestation of that process of seeing and understanding. And so I think the study of art history is really the study of how we as human beings both see and interact with our daily lives.
Okay.
So
the choices that people make to say that this is art and this isn't?
That's a tough question, and I pose it to my students a lot. What is art? Because we do have definitions of art, as much as all of my students will say, it's whatever you want it to be. I really think that when it comes down to it, art is an expression made by a human being, made by a sentient being, somebody who has transformed materials from one state into another, and in the process of transforming them has involved themselves in the materials in some way.
Okay. Well, my wife teaches art, philosophy of art, as you may know, but there's a distinction between art and craft.
Yes.
So what you just described, I'm not sure I can see the difference between art and craft there.
Well, honestly, there isn't a whole lot, in my opinion.
All right.
back in the history of art, there was a distinction between the fine arts, the big capital A art, as it were, and craft or artisanship or decorative arts. And really, to do a thing well is just as artistic in my mind as to paint a painting. I think that what we mean by capital A art tends to be when you make something, to take from Oscar Wilde and James McNeill Whistler, when you make something maybe a little useless.
Okay.
It's not functional. But really, I think that kind of distinction has started to be critiqued in art history these days.
Okay, so for example, the Princess Phone. Are you familiar with that one?
No.
Okay, that's in one of the museums of technology, and it was so artistic and so beautifully done that it had to be put in this art museum, in quotes.
Oh, fun.
Not capital with a capital A, but so I think there are other examples of that. None come to mind right away, but I'm sure that there are other. Just kitchen appliances.
Plates are a big one.
Teapots. Even toaster ovens and things like that. Some of them have an aesthetic that borders on art.
Absolutely.
Now, I said borders on art. Now, you might say it's already art, but
I think part of it is, yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, so that's a broad sweep of art in general. So you had to pick a topic, and let me give away something here. Mine was like a desperation thing. Like, it has to be something. And I have no idea, and I had really no issue, no burning issue at all. Not even an actual interest in it. It was just, it had to be a topic that nobody else did, and that nobody else wanted, and that had, a little bit of interest for me. So it wasn't like a big deal for me.
Right.
So was there, what made you pick your topic? Was there something more than that, or?
Well, I will admit to floundering around a bit the first few years of graduate school. I knew I wanted to study art history because, as I had described, I found myself drawn to these objects. I wasn't really quite sure why. I hadn't really put into words what I just described for you, which is why I think art history is so important. But I found myself really drawn to these paintings by J.W.M Turner, who's a British painter, watercolorist. He's one of the more famous British artists of the early 19th century. And what I really loved about Turner's work was the garden spaces, these landscapes, these ruinous forms.
This is the one that the film was made about, right?
Yes, the film,
Okay.
But the spaces that he depicted were just so beautiful, and for very cliche reasons, I loved them. I just loved looking at them. And as I started to look at his work, I was particularly fascinated by a series he did based on the burning of the Houses of Parliament in the 1830s. Because he went to this event. It was a catastrophe, really. The Houses of Parliament burned down in October of 1834, and Turner was there amongst the crowd, and he was frantically, doing these sketches and even working some up in very minor watercolors, pretty much there on the spot. And his initial thought was to make them into the burning of Rome. He was going to work these up into a sketch of the burning of Rome. But what he decided to do was to actually depict the event. And the way he depicted the interaction of nature and art, and both the strength and futility of man in those scenes, was just so captivating. I started thinking about nature and man, and thinking about how do you capture ephemeral moments, things that don't belong in permanent object form, like a painting or a sculpture. How do you make them permanent in that way? And so I started to think about landscapes themselves and that experience. Because when you go into a garden, it's different from being in front of a painting. The garden is a space where you are surrounded by the artwork. And the artwork is nature, and nature is the artwork. And all of these definitions get very loose and borderless. And the way the various artists of the early 19th century tried to portray not just a description of the landscape, but the feeling of being there. They're really grasping at ways to visually depict this ephemeral physical experience. And that really interested me in trying to get to the heart of what kind of experience they're having at that time.
So the painting should help the viewer recreate the feeling of really being there?
In some cases, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. This just has nothing to do with anything, but in the movie, there's a little scene there where they're critiquing his painting and say, "Oh, it's worthless." And then he comes in with a dab of red paint and puts.
Why on earth would he go and do that? He's ruined a masterpiece. It's a boy. It's a boy.
Really
yes,
do that?
That is real. Yes,
oh,
absolutely.
No way.
So what happened was it didn't quite happen the way it happened in the movie, but Constable, who was a big rival of his in the art world, actually had a painting, and he critiqued Constable for having too much red. And he said that if Constable didn't fix it by the time the show went up, he would show him up, essentially. So he took his painting called Helvoetsluis, and it was hung next or near Turner's or Constable's, and Turner came in and put just one little dab of red in the middle of the painting.
I see.
And it completely destroyed the effect. It showed how overblown the red in Constable's painting was because of the reserved way Turner had used it. And Constable came in and said, "Turner has been here and he's fired a shot."
Okay.
So he's quite a dramatic guy.
Okay. So, all right, so your dissertation was on Turner then? And that
well, my master's thesis was.
Oh, okay.
My dissertation didn't touch on Turner at all.
Oh, it didn't?
Actually.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right. So you went from Turner to something else.
Yeah, well.
Where the picturesque comes in.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So I went from Turner specifically, and that's who I wrote my master's thesis on, to starting to think about the things he was depicting rather than his paintings of them. So this, for instance, is... so this was a great exhibition. It was called Ruin Lust, and it was at the Tate Britain. But this shows...
Okay, but we'll hold it up here, and then we'll switch to that later on. Yeah. And so, go ahead.
And so I got interested in what these spaces actually looked like, because if they're depicting an experience, what is that actual experience? And as I dug, I found this whole world of the picturesque and landscape design and the use of art in various ways to create an experience in a landscape. And I became incredibly fascinated with sham ruins, which are ruinous structures that are built to look ruined. They're more sculpture than architecture in a lot of ways. So this is one of the key focal points of my dissertation. This is
this one.
Yep, Wimpole Estate in Cambridgeshire. And that is the Gothic Folly, or the Gothic Tower. Now, that was built as it looks pretty much here, ruined and in pieces in the 1700s. And it was built to look like that. Okay,
and when does this movement start? When does this idea get started? These things start to get built.
Yeah, so the vogue for sham ruins really begins in the mid-1700s.
Okay.
1740s and 50s. But the real mania for it kind of picks up speed, and in the 1760s and 70s is when you really see an explosion of these things, and then they start to peter out around the 1800s, 1810s. Okay. So this really, the Wimpole Estate Gothic Folly was conceived of in the beginning of this idea, and then was built at the height of the fashion, and then was continued to be altered all the way through the end of this fashion in garden design. So it's a very interesting case study in the role of these kinds of objects.
Okay, so which way are the ideas flowing here? I'm a little confused.
Yeah.
Okay, because we have landscape paintings, and we have gardens, and wanting to help the viewer recreate an experience that you could have in real life through looking at the painting. But now we're having things being built that are recreating an experience actually that you might have maybe in Rome or something, or might not have anywhere. It sounds more like the set design for, the
Absolutely.
One of the films. What am I trying to think of? The Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
What is this?
That's exactly what it is. In many cases, this is exactly what the picturesque means. It was a kind of fashion, the design principle, that you would make gardens to look like paintings of gardens.
Okay.
The thing is that those paintings of gardens were usually capricci, that is, imaginary renditions of a space that maybe the artist saw, but they then add little imaginative touches.
We might have to start all over again. So, in other words, let's say there's a virtual reality game. Okay, that's very popular, and then somebody comes along and says, "No, you know what? Let's make a place that looks like the virtual reality game."
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is, yes. And then that influences further paintings and different ways of depicting these new spaces. So there's this, it's a conversation. It's not a linear progression.
I see. So when do paintings featuring this kind of building come into?
Depends on what you mean by featuring. If you mean paintings that included ruins of imaginary types, this goes back all the way, probably before Claude Lorrain, but he was really the big influence in creating these capricci paintings.
And when was he?
So Claude Lorrain, you're talking about the 1600s.
Okay.
And his work is really, a lot of it is at the Roman countryside or the Italian countryside, and he would include little ruins or buildings where they weren't in real life.
You need a dissertation on this.
This is my dissertation, absolutely.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay, so there's this whole long romance with rediscovering our ancient roots.
Yes.
That goes, and this is in the history of philosophy, and it gets started back in the 1300s.
Yes.
And then, actually, by the time the 15 and 1600s that's kind of over. But there are other movements, apparently, going on at the same time in a different realm, in a different intellectual and aesthetic space.
Most definitely. And I think as far as the architectural kind of rebirth of those same ideas that they're thinking about in the Renaissance comes about with the height of the Grand Tour from England and France to Italy, seeing the ruins of Rome and various places.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But what's happening in England during the 1700s with these sham ruins is kind of a combination of wanting to make a garden space look like a painting when there's no ruin actually there. But the other part of my dissertation has to do with this. You mentioned theatrical backgrounds, and part of my work was showing that these things are not just built to be understood as they appear. So nobody was fooled by this particular Gothic structure.
Well, some of the millennials that were brought up.
Millennials will be fooled.
They would be fooled.
Right, but in the 17th century, when this thing was built, you would not have been fooled, because you would have been allowed, if you were of a privileged class, of course, to go in and look around on the inside. And on the inside of this structure, there's brickwork behind this masonry facade. And then you could climb the tower and then look out over the thing. And so part of it was reflecting on history, but also how we reconstruct history. What kind of fictions or theatrical devices are required to mediate history and make it useful, not just for the sake of itself, but for the future.
Okay, great.
To create new things.
Have you been in this tower?
Yes.
Okay, so I put myself in that situation. I try to, get back in that zone, that era. I climb the tower. You get to the top and you look out. What am I thinking? What were you thinking? Well, no, wait a minute. Let's back.
Okay.
Not back. I don't want to know what you were thinking.
Okay.
Because you have this academic thing. I want to know what someone of that era might have thought. Hi, here we are again, and we're going to pick up where we left off in the last tape, where we had some technical difficulties, and so now we're going to talk about the tower again.
Yes.
And we were talking about imagining what somebody who went up there, what they would be, what their experience would be like, what they would be thinking about.
Right.
And you were saying...
Yeah, so the tower at Wimpole, as I was saying before, the experience of going up in that tower, it really relies on a certain kind of person. So we were talking about the class of people that would visit these things. And primarily they would have an education in Edmund Burke's philosophical treatise on the beautiful and the sublime. We would also have, they would know Addison, James Thomson, various poets, as well as philosophers on taste and beauty. And one of the things that they would see when they looked out from the tower, say on a nice sunny day in the middle of summer, is one that's very much like this. From the tower, you're looking back onto the 18th century manor house, and you're looking over these beautiful grassy rolling hills, and this is really a very typical Burkean sublime, or Burkean beautiful, excuse me. And what that means is that everything is soft and safe and beautiful and peaceful.
Now, when Burke is writing about this?
Yes.
Okay, does he provide any audio-visual materials, or is he just describing it and hoping that people will...
He's a writer and a philosopher primarily. Yeah. His philosophical treatise is something that people of a certain educated class would know, and others had illustrated or given examples of what he's doing.
Okay.
So he's not an artist per se. He's really describing
the point
everything.
is everyone knows what he's talking about. It's not.
Yes.
It's not that hard to understand.
Yeah. Well, and this is during the era where they're really trying to codify taste, and they're trying to understand and really come to a consensus on what these very tricky, subjective words mean, like beautiful and tasteful and all of that.
So once again, this would be something that would be banned in contemporary society. Because there would then be experts and judges, and,
yes.
and they would be, presumably monitoring people and telling them that, no, you're misusing that word.
Right. Well, and I would hope it wouldn't get to that point, but yes. So they're trying to codify it. They're trying to get to a consensus about these things.
Let's step back again from this and look at this philosophically. Of course, this is a good thing for philosophers. Because when you to try to codify, to try to abstract from many examples and come up with some sort of understanding or definition is what you're supposed to do.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, exactly.
All right, so anyway, this is the beautiful, according to Burke.
Yes, so if you were up in the tower and, say, a storm hit and you saw lightning and wind and rain, and things became a little terrifying for you. You're still safe because you're inside, but what you're seeing is now some kind of awe-striking scene that is a little overwhelming and a little terrifying, and that's what we would call the sublime.
Okay.
So the sublime is another theme that artists like to take up, especially Turner, who I mentioned to you earlier. His Burning of the Houses of Parliament, which we talked about before, is really a perfect example of this, where you're safe on the other bank of the river, Thames, but on the other side you're seeing this gorgeous scene. It's aesthetically pleasing, but it's also terrifying. Nature the element of fire has overwhelmed the works of man. And so this would be, according to Burke, a sublime image. So it's kind of set up as the opposite of the beautiful. They're usually set in distinction with each other. Between these two things is what's called the picturesque. So the picturesque, and that's why ruins tend to be a very excellent source for the picturesque. It's got some sublime quality with a temporal element.
And so we're looking at the tower now.
Right, we're looking at the Tower of Wimpole here, and as you're looking at the tower rather than from the tower, you're now getting that third kind of aesthetic, which is the picturesque.
Okay.
Nature is overwhelming the works of man, but it's not terrifying. It's sort of beautiful, the way the vegetation is crawling up on the brickwork, and it's also safe. we can wander around these ruins, and we're not worried about it falling down on our heads. Yeah. But there's what at the time would have been called variety. And that has a more specific meaning in the 18th century than it does now. It usually means rough or untextured, or highly textured, and very indicative of work or other things that are not considered beautiful or sublime. So it's this weird middle category between the two.
Okay. Yeah, all right. So let's go through. You had a couple of other examples here. This Turner, Tintern Abbey.
Yeah, so what's interesting about the picturesque, as we discussed, is that it's really, the picturesque as a term, we should be very careful because it really can only be applied to landscape gardens or other things that are not pictures. Because to say something is a picture-like picture is kind of a tautology.
Okay.
But what's happening with things like Turner's Tintern Abbey is he's actually painting the ruins of an abbey. This is an actual abbey, but the landscaping around it and even the pieces of the ruins themselves had been moved and shifted and renovated to have the same aesthetic as the picturesque, as pretty much started and codified by Claude Lorraine, the painter.
Okay.
And so it's this kind of, scene where you have variety in vegetation, but also the works of man and the architecture. So here, what Turner is doing is very interesting, is because it's a picture of a landscape that was designed according to the rules of another kind of picture.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so it gets very complicated.
It does, yes,
and,
absolutely.
So that's kind of what we've seen in your dissertation and your work in general. So it's quite complicated.
Yes.
And all these images and ideas reflecting off of each other.
Indeed. It's really a kind of a game of telephone.
Yeah.
You have these pictures, and then people are designing their gardens to look like pictures, and then artists drawing pictures and other kind of media in order to evoke the experience of that garden.
Well, we really like that whole idea of evoking experiences.
Yes.
And so I think I did mention virtual reality, becomes actual
Absolutely.
reality. I think we're going to get very confused in the coming century. But it's all been done before. I think this is the amazing thing.
Most definitely.
So all right. Well, that's great. I think that explains it a little bit.
Wonderful.
And so let's say goodbye and enjoy your picturesque vacation. Bye.
Thanks so much.